All right, let's get started. So, I'm going to actually catch up on some poetry that we were supposed to have dealt with in the week on Romanticism, but we'll deal with it today in order to try to establish a contrast, and also look at some poetry originally written in English by Wordsworth in particular, in order to really thematize the question of modernism. So when we had poetry on the syllabus on our agenda for reading, previously it was in the context of Romanticism, and the transition from Romanticism to modernism is going to be significant. It's something that, of course, Adorno's lyric poetry and society takes up as his theme when he's distinguishing between Goethe, Morica, and Jorge, the three examples of poetry in his essay. But like I said, it might do us some good to look at some English language poetry to help us along with this. Now, the other thing that we have to address this week, last week we introduced Marxism a little bit in order to discuss really the question of modernity and modernism per se. We're going to kind of fill out some of our consideration of Marxism this week in order to help set us up for our continuing reading from Adorno. Namely, we're going to start getting into aesthetic theory next week. So, let me remind you guys that the selections from aesthetic theory that we have, we're not reading or we're not focusing in our class discussions on the entirety of aesthetic theory, but only on certain sections. So the sections that are not within brackets, we will focus on in our class discussion. The sections in brackets, the page numbers in brackets, are supplemental, optional, recommended, but we won't focus on them as much. So for next time, we'll look at his draft introduction, which comes at the end of the book, because this is a posthumously published incomplete work by Adorno. And then we'll look at the part of the manuscript that actually introduces the book in its extant form, and that is Art, Society, and Aesthetics and Situation. So that is pages 1 through 45. And then additionally, in brackets, we have 45 to 100, again, optional. So the main focus will be on that draft introduction, 332 to 359, and pages 1 through 45. Any volunteers to take the lead on our discussion threads for next time? Okay, that's one. Okay, great. You guys? Next time. All right, so bring us back to our week of Romanticism. Also bring up our discussion thread for this week. Hopefully this will work for us. We have the first draft of link that I have maybe is not working the same way. Okay, so the very first version of the Prelude. So the Prelude was Wordsworth's kind of long, almost epic poem that was about how the poet came to be who he was. In other words, it's the sort of biography of the writer in becoming the writer. So the very first version of the Prelude is titled "Was It For This?" And let's just look at this because this will help us kind of bring us into the modern era of lyric poetry. And also, we could consider Wordsworth's Prelude to be not only an autobiographical work, but also a kind of synthesis of poetry and philosophy, meaning it's his sort of philosophy of aesthetics as well as his autobiography. And we have some inklings of this in this early version. Was it for this that one, the fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song, and from his alder shades and rocky falls, and from his fords and shallows, sent a voice to intertwine my dreams? For this didst thou, O Derwent, traveling over the green plains near my sweet birthplace, didst thou, beauteous stream, give ceaseless music to the night and day, which with its steady cadence tempering our human waywardness, composed by thoughts to more than infant softness, giving me amid the fretful tenements of man a knowledge, a dim earnest, of the calm that nature breathes among her woodland haunts. Was it for this, and now I speak of things that have been and that are no gentle dreams, complacent, fashioned fondly to adorn the time of unremembering being? Was it for this that I, a 4 years old, or 4 years child, beneath thy scars and in thy silent pools, made one long bathing of a summer's day, basked in the sun or plunged into thy streams, alternate, all a summer's day, or coursed over the sandy plains and dashed the flowers of yellow groundsel, or when the hilltops, the woods, and all the distant mountains were bronzed with a deep radiance, stood alone, a naked savage in the thunder shower. For this in springtime, when our southern banks the shining sun had from his knot of leaves decoyed the primrose flower, and when the vales and woods were warm, was I a rover then in the high places, on the lonely peaks, amongst the mountains and winds? Though mean and though inglorious were my views, the end was not ignoble. Oh, when I have hung above the raven's nest, have hung alone by half-inch fissures in the slippery rock, but ill-sustained and almost, as it seemed, suspended by the wind which blew amain against the naked crag, then, while on the perilous edge I hung alone, with what strange utterance did the loud, dry wind blow through my ears? The sky seemed not a sky of earth, and with what motion moved the clouds. Not in vain, ye beings of the hills, and ye that walk the woods and open heaths, by moon or starlight thus from my first day of childhood, did ye love to interweave the passions that build up our human soul, not with the mean and vulgar works of man, but with high objects, with eternal things, with life and nature, purifying thus the elements of feeling and of thought, and sanctifying by such discipline both pain and fear, until we recognize a grandeur in the beatings of the heart. Not in vain, ye spirits of the springs, and ye that have your voices in the clouds, and ye that are familiars of the lakes and standing pools, not for trivial ends, through snow and sunshine and the sparkling plains of moonlight frost, and through the stormy day, did ye with such assiduous love pursue your favorite and your joy. I may not think a vulgar hope was yours when ye employed such ministry, when ye, through many a year, thus by the agency of boyish sports, impressed upon the streams, the woods, the hills, impressed upon all forms, the characters of danger and desire, and thus did make the surface of the universal earth with meanings of delight, of hope and fear, work like a sea. For this, when on the withered mountain slope, the frost and breath The frost and breath of frosty wind had nipped the last autumnal crocus. Did I love to range through half the night among the cliffs and the smooth hollows where the woodcocks ran and the moonlight turf. In thought and wish, that time my shoulder all with springs hung, I was a fell destroyer. Gentle powers who give us happiness and call it peace. When scudding on from snare to snare, I plied my anxious visitation, hurrying on, still hurrying onward. How my heart panted among the lonely yew trees and the crags that looked upon me. How my bosom beat with hope and fear. Sometimes strong desire resistless overcame me, and the bird that was the captive of another's toils became my prey. And when the deed was done, I heard among the solitary hills low breathings coming after me and sounds of undistinguishable motion, steps as silent as the turf they trod. Oh no, okay. Nor while, though doubting yet not lost, I tread the mazes of this argument and paint how nature by collateral interest and by extrinsic passion peopled first my mind with beauteous objects. May I well forget what might demand a loftier song, how oft the eternal spirit, he that is his life in unimaginable things, and he who painting what he is in all the visible imagery of all the worlds, is yet apparent chiefly as the soul of our first sympathies. O bounteous power, in childhood, in rememberable days, how often did thy love renew for me those naked feelings, which when thou wouldst form a living thing, thou sendest like a breeze into its infant being. Soul of things, how often did thy love renew for me those hallowed and pure motions of the sense, which seem in their simplicity to own an intellectual charm. That calm delight, which, if I err not, surely must belong to those firstborn affinities, which fit our new existence to existing things, and in our dawn of being constitute the bond of union betwixt life and joy. Yes, I remember when the changeful earth and twice 5 seasons on my mind had stamped the faces of the changeful year. Even then, a child I held unconscious intercourse with the eternal beauty, drinking a pure organic pleasure from the lines of curling mist, or from the smooth expanse of waters colored by the cloudless moon. The sands of Westmoreland, the creeks and bays of Cumbria's rocky limits, they can tell how when the sea threw off his evening shade into the shepherd's hut beneath the crags, did send sweet notice of the rising moon. How I have stood to images like this, a stranger, linking with the spectacle no body of associated forms, and bearing with me no peculiar sense of quietness or peace. Yet I have stood, even while my eye has moved over 3 long leagues of shining water, gathering as it seemed new pleasure like a bee among the flowers. Nor unsubservient even to noblest ends are these primordial feelings. How serene, how calm these seem amid the swell of human passion. Even yet I feel their tranquilizing power. Not while through doubting yet lost, I tread the, oh, excuse me, did I do that? Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, their tranquilizing power. That's the poem. All right, so I think that I mentioned at the time that in the long version of the Prelude and in the full version, that the big turning point for him is when he goes enthusiastically to France to participate in the French Revolution, and then is sort of terrified by the mob and sort of runs away, and then decides that he's done with politics and that only nature will be his kind of guide, right? So it's a very kind of dramatic turn that happens, and that he thinks is decisive in terms of his sensibility as a poet. Nonetheless, he didn't entirely lose interest in politics, as we'll see. So the short poems that I had selected from Wordsworth contain some. A reference. So specifically, Toussaint L'Ouverture. So he's the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which took place during the French Revolution. That's the revolt of the slaves in the French colony in Haiti. That was inspired by the French Revolution and inspired particularly by the Jacobins in France, the radical phase of the French Revolution. Now, what happened to him tragically was that Napoleon reasserted control over Haiti and ultimately had Toussaint Louverture arrested, brought back to France as a criminal rebel. All right, so let's hear what Wordsworth had to say about Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint, the most unhappy man of men. Whether the whistling rustic tend his plough within thy hearing, or thy head be now pillowed in some deep dungeon's earless den, O miserable chieftain, where and when wilt thou find patience? Yet die not. Do thou wear rather in thy bonds a cheerful brow, though fallen thyself, never to rise again, live and take comfort. Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies. There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. Thou hast great allies. Thy friends are exaltations, agonies, and love, and man's unconquerable mind. There is a bondage worse, far worse to bear, than his who breathes by roof and floor and wall, pent in a tyrant's solitary thrall. 'Tis his who walks about in the open air, one of a nation who henceforth must wear their fetters in their souls. For who could be, who even the best in such condition, free from self-reproach, reproach that he must share with human nature? Never be it ours to see the sun how brightly it will shine, and know that noble feelings, manly powers, instead of gathering strength, must droop and pine, and earth with all her pleasant fruits and flowers fade and participate in man's decline. Characteristics of a child 3 years old. Loving she is, intractable though wild, and innocence hath privilege in her, to dignify arch looks and laughing eyes, and feats of cunning, and the pretty round of trespasses, affected to provoke mock chastisement and partnership in play. And as a faggot spark pulls on the hearth, not least if unattended and alone, when both young and old sit gathered round and take delight in its activity, even so this happy creature of herself is all sufficient. Solitude to her is blithe society, who fills the air with gladness and involuntary songs. Light are her sallies, as the tripping fawns, forth startled from the fern where she lay couched, unthought of, unexpected, as the stir of the soft breeze, ruffling the meadow flowers, or from before it chasing wantonly the many-colored images impressed upon the bosom of a placid lake. The last of these. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margins of the bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with daffodils. So in the context that we had read Schiller's Letters in the Aesthetic Education of Man, the theme there was, in Romanticism, the idea of a reconciliation of humanity and nature. So something that Kant had discussed in terms of the appearance of nature, what nature represents to us because of its apparent spontaneity. But precisely we, according to Kant, identify with nature because we regard nature as free in a way that it might not be in itself, but we regard it as such because we regard its spontaneity, its organic life, its phenomena as evidence of freedom, as evidence of autonomy. But that by the time the Romantics are coming around, it seems that there's a disparity between humanity and nature that then demands reconciliation. Hegel, who we read after Schiller, also addresses this in his argument for why art is higher than nature in its appearance of freedom. Not only despite, but especially because of its artificial character. Dialectic of nature and freedom. We recall from the first reading that we did from Kant, two kinds of concepts of nature and concepts of freedom. Concepts of what is and concepts of what ought to be. So hopefully that sets us up a little bit for how nature and humanity and subjectivity of nature and of humanity are going to change, however slightly, in the examples that Adorno is providing in his essay. Before we get into Adorno, I want to look at Marcuse. Just look at some passages from this. So Marcuse is another colleague of Adorno's. We have Walter Benjamin as a colleague of Adorno's, Max Horkheimer as a colleague of Adorno's. Now, last week, did we look at, we might not have, did we look at The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom? Did we look at Horkheimer? Okay, so we'll do that this week. But let's look at Marcuse first and the way he connects up dialectical philosophy and poetry and art more generally. So this is the preface to a book by Marcuse on Hegel. It's called Reason and Revolution. So here's Marcuse. This book was written in the hope that it would make a small contribution to the revival, not of Hegel, but of a mental faculty which is in danger of being obliterated, the power of negative thinking. As Hegel defines it, thinking is indeed essentially the negation of that which is immediately before us. What does he mean by negation, the central category of dialectic? Even Hegel's most abstract and metaphysical concepts are saturated with experience. And again, recall that the goal of Kant, his philosophy, his critical philosophy, was to establish the reality of the subject of experience, meaning the subject that can be transformed. Experience of a world in which the unreasonable becomes reasonable, and as such determines the facts, in which unfreedom is the condition of freedom, and war the guarantor of peace. This world contradicts itself. Common sense and science purge themselves from this contradiction. But philosophical thought begins with the recognition that the facts do not correspond to the concepts imposed by common sense and scientific reason. In short, with the refusal to accept them. To the extent that these concepts disregard the fatal contradictions which make up reality, they abstract from the very process of reality. The negation which dialectic applies to them is not only a critique of a conformistic logic, which denies the reality of contradictions, it is also a critique of the given state of affairs on its own grounds, of the established system of life, which denies its own promises and potentialities. Today, this dialectical mode of thought is alien to the whole established universe of discourse and action. It seems to belong to the past and to have be rebutted by the achievements of technological civilization. The established reality seems promising and productive enough to repel or absorb all alternatives. Thus, acceptance or even affirmation of this reality appears to be the only reasonable methodological principle. Moreover, it precludes neither criticism nor change. On the contrary, insistence on the dynamic character of the status quo, on its constant revolutions, is one of the strongest props for this attitude. Yet this dynamic seems to operate endlessly within the same framework of life, streamlining rather than abolishing the domination of man, both by man and by the products of his labor. Progress becomes quantitative and tends to delay indefinitely the turn from quantity to quality. That is, the emergence of new modes of existence with new forms of reason and freedom. The power of negative thinking is the driving power of dialectical thought, used as a tool for analyzing the world of facts in terms of its internal inadequacy. I choose this vague and unscientific formulation in order to sharpen the contrast between dialectical and undialectical thinking. Inadequacy implies a value judgment. Dialectical thought invalidates the a priori opposition of value and fact by understanding all facts as stages of a single process, a process in which subject and object are so joined that truth can be determined only within the subject-object totality. All facts embody the knower as well as the doer. They continuously translate the past into the present. The objects thus contain subjectivity in their very structure. I'm going to jump ahead here. Interpretation of that which is in terms of that which is not. Confrontation of the given facts with that which they exclude. This has been the concern of philosophy wherever philosophy was more than a matter of ideological justification or mental exercise. The liberating function of negation in philosophical thought depends on the recognition that the negation is a positive act. That which is repels that which is not, and in doing so repels its own real possibilities. Consequently, to express and define that which is, on its own terms, is to distort and falsify reality. Reality is other and more than that codified in the logic and language of facts. Here is the interlink between dialectical thought and the effort of avant-garde literature. The effort to break the power of facts over the word, and to speak a language which is not the language of those who establish, enforce, and benefit from the facts. As the power of the given facts tends to become totalitarian, to absorb all opposition and to define the entire universe of discourse, the effort to speak the language of contradiction appears increasingly irrational, obscure, and artificial. The question is not that of a direct or indirect influence of Hegel on the genuine avant-garde, although this is evident in Mallarmé and Villers de Adam. In surrealism, in Brecht, dialectic and poetic language meet rather on common ground. The common element is the search for an authentic language, the language of negation, as the great refusal to accept the rules of a game in which the dice are loaded. The absent must be made present because the greater part of the truth is in that which is absent. This is Mallarmé's classic formulation or statement. He writes, I say flower, and out of the oblivion where my voice banishes all contours, musically rises, different from every known blossom, the one absent from all bouquets, idea itself and delicate. In the authentic language, the word is not the expression of a thing, but rather the absence of this thing. The word makes the things disappear and imposes upon us the feeling of a universal want and even of its own want. Poetry is thus the power to deny the things. the power which Hegel claims paradoxically for all authentic thought. Valery asserts, in short, thought is the labor which brings to life in us that which does not exist. He asks the rhetorical question, what are we without the help of that which does not exist? This is not existentialism. It is something more vital and more desperate, the effort to contradict a reality in which all logic and all speech are false to the extent that they are part of a mutilated whole. The vocabulary and grammar of the language of contradiction are still those of the game. There are no others. But the concepts codified in the language of the games are redefined by relating them to their determinate negation. This term, which denotes the governing principle of dialectical thought, can be explained only in a textual interpretation of Hegel's logic. Here it must suffice to emphasize that, by virtue of this principle, the dialectical contradiction is distinguished from all pseudo and crackpot opposition, beatnik and hipsterism. The negation is determinate if it refers the established state of affairs to the basic factors and forces which make for its destructiveness, as well as for the possible alternatives beyond the status quo. In the human reality, they are historical factors and forces, and the determinate negation is ultimately a political negation. As such, it may well find authentic expression in non-political language, and the more so as the entire dimension of politics becomes an integral part of the status quo. Dialectical logic is critical logic. It reveals modes and contents of thought which transcend the codified powers of use and validation. Dialectical thought does not invent these contents, they have accrued in the notions in the long tradition of thought and action. Jump ahead again. This historical stage has changed the situation of philosophy and of all cognitive thought. From this stage on, all thinking that does not testify to an awareness of the radical falsity of the established forms of life is faulty thinking. Abstraction from this all-pervasive condition is not merely immoral, it is false. For reality has become technological reality, and the subject is now joined with the object so closely that the notion of object necessarily includes the subject. Abstraction from their interrelation no longer leads to a more genuine reality, but to deception. Because even in this sphere, the subject itself is apparently a constitutive part of the object as scientifically determined. The observing, measuring, calculating subject of scientific method and the subject of the daily business of life, both are expressions of the same subjectivity, man. One did not have to wait for Hiroshima in order to have one's eyes open to this identity. And as always before, the subject that has conquered matter suffers under the dead weight of his conquest. Those who enforce and direct this conquest have used it to create a world in which the increasing comforts of life and the ubiquitous power of the productive apparatus keep man enslaved to the prevailing state of affairs. Those social groups which dialectical theory identified as the forces of negation are either defeated or reconciled with the established system. Before the power of the given facts, the power of negative thinking stands condemned. This power of facts is an oppressive power. It is the power of man over man, appearing as objective and rational condition. Against this appearance, thought continues to protest in the name of truth, and in the name of fact. For it is the supreme and universal fact that the status quo perpetuates itself through the constant threat of atomic destruction, through the unprecedented waste of resources, through mental impoverishment, and last but not least, through brute force. These are the unresolved contradictions. They define every single fact and every single event. They permeate the entire universe of discourse and action. Thus they define also the logic of things, that is, the mode of thought capable of piercing the ideology and of comprehending reality whole. No method can claim a monopoly of cognition. But no method seems authentic which does not recognize that these two propositions are meaningful descriptions of our situation. The whole is the truth, and the whole is false. Okay, so the whole is the truth, that's Hegel, and the whole is false is Adorno. We'll get there. thought that we might have done this last week. No, we did not. We did not do this last week? No. All right, so this is Max Horkheimer. He's the sort of head honcho. He's the boss of the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research, which Adorno and Marcuse were members of. He's writing here that Marcuse was from 1960. This Horkheimer is from a good deal earlier. It's from the period at the end of the Weimar Republic, from 1926 to 1931. It's from a book of aphorisms called Dämmerung. Similar title and maybe an homage to Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a book of aphorisms called Dämmerung as well. And Dämmerung means twilight. It could mean either dusk or dawn. So it could mean the end of something or the beginning of something. Let's see what Horkheimer has to say. And this is to refresh us on some things that we talked about last week about Marxism and the attitude towards capitalism. The little man in the philosophy of freedom. In socialism, freedom is to become a reality. But because the present system is called free and considered liberal, it's not terribly clear what this may mean. Yet anyone who keeps his eyes open and has a little money in his pocket actually has ample occasion to familiarize himself with this concept. He may, for example, ask an acquaintance for a job in his firm. That has nothing to do with philosophy. But his acquaintance knits his brow and says that this is objectively impossible. Business is bad, he says, and he's even been obliged to let many employees go. The man should not be angry with him, for it is not within his power. His freedom doesn't extend that far. The businessman is subject to laws, which neither he nor anyone else, nor any power with such a mandate, created with purpose and deliberation. They are laws which the big capitalists, and perhaps he himself, skillfully make use of, but whose existence must be accepted as a fact. Boom, bust, inflation, wars, and even the qualities of things and of human beings the present society demands are a function of such laws, of the anonymous social reality. Just as the rotation of the earth expresses the laws of dead nature. No single individual can do anything about them. Bourgeois thought views this reality as superhuman. It fetishizes the social process. It speaks of fate and either calls it blind or attempts a mystical interpretation. It deplores the meaninglessness of the whole or submits to the inscrutability of God's ways. But in actuality, all those phenomena which are either experienced as accidental or given a mystical interpretation depend on men and the way they arrange their social existence. They can therefore also be changed. If men consciously took their life and society in hand and replaced the struggle of capitalist enterprises by a classless and planned economy, the effects the process of production has on human beings and their relationships could also be understood and regulated. What today appears as a fact of nature in the private and business dealings of individuals are the effects of social life as a whole. They are human, not divine products. Because these effects of life in society are present but not conscious, willed, or controlled, and are the results of an equal number of individual wills that grasp neither their dependence nor their power, the limitation on individual freedom in our time is immeasurably greater than would be necessary given the available means. When the businessman whom his acquaintance asks for a job refuses because conditions don't permit it, he thinks he is referring to something purely objective and totally autonomous, reality itself. Since everyone else, including the petitioner, feels the same because the reality they themselves created through their social activity appears as something alien by which they must abide, it follows that there are many agents, but no conscious and therefore free subjects of social conditions. Men must submit to conditions they themselves constantly create as to something alien and overwhelmingly powerful. Insight is not enough, of course, to change the state of affairs. For the error is not that people do not recognize the subject, but that the subject does not exist. Everything, therefore, depends on creating the free subject that consciously shapes social life. And this subject is nothing other than the rationally organized socialist society which regulates its own existence. In the society as it now is, there are many individual subjects whose freedom is severely limited because they are unconscious of what they do. But there is no being that creates reality, no coherent ground. Religion and metaphysics claim that such a ground exists. In so doing, they try to keep men from creating it through their own efforts. Of course, the present lack of freedom does not apply equally to all. An element of freedom exists when the product is consonant with the interests of the producer. All those who work, and even those who don't, have a share in the creation of contemporary reality, but the degree of that consonance varies considerably. Those for whom it is high seem responsible for reality in a sense. They speak of our reality as if they were royalty, and rightly so. For although they did not themselves create the world, one cannot but suspect that they would have made it exactly as it is. It suits them perfectly that the production and preservation of reality in our society proceed blindly. They have every reason to approve of the product of this blind process, and therefore support all legends concerning its origin. But for the little man who is turned down when he asks for a job because objective conditions make it impossible, it is most important that their origin be brought to the light of day, so that they do not continue being unfavorable to him. Not only his own lack of freedom, but that of others as well, spells his doom. His interest lies in the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. So what we're tracing now is the change between, broadly speaking, Kant's time and the 20th century. So we've already come at it from a couple of different angles. We did Nietzsche, and then we did Lukacs. And Lukacs brought us to the threshold of Marxism. So we read the pre-Marxist writing by Lukacs before he himself converted to Marxism in the context of World War I and the Russian Revolution. And I described last week how Lukacs' theory of the novel is a product of a kind of neo-Hegelianism at the turn of the 20th century. There was a neo-Kantianism at the end of the 19th century, and it followed by a neo-Hegelianism at the turn of the 20th century. But now we're really getting into Marxism. We've read previously from Adorno the Fantasia sopra Carmen, but he wasn't really playing up the Marxist angle very much in that piece. He was staying more imminent to Nietzsche and Wagner and Bizet, Carmen. Here, it's more directly thematized. So, Lyric Poetry in Society, this piece, is a radio lecture that he gave. So he had his own radio show, and he gave lectures on the radio, and he published the radio lectures. He published several books of essays, many of which were taken from his radio lectures. So you can imagine yourself driving on the Autobahn, tuning in, and you hear this. The announcement of a lecture on lyric poetry in society will make a good many of you uncomfortable. You will expect a sociological study of the sort which can take any subject at once under consideration. Just as 50 years ago we had psychologies, 30 years ago phenomenologies of every conceivable thing. This is from 1955. You will fear that a discussion of conditions under which works of art have come into being and their subsequent effects must impertinently preempt the place belonging to the experience of those works as such. That sociological orderings and relatings will suppress all insight into the truth or falsity of the objects themselves. You will suspect an intellectual of being likely to commit the error ascribed to the formal directorate, though while scanning the whole, he will merely stand above the particular instance of which he speaks. That is, he will not see it, but merely label it. Such a method becomes most distressing when applied to lyric poetry. The tenderest, most fragile forms must be touched by, even brought together with, precisely that social bustle from which the ideals of our traditional conception of poetry have sought to protect them. A sphere of expression whose very essence lies in defying the power of social organization, either by refusing to see it or by overcoming it through the pathos of distance, as in Baudelaire or Nietzsche, must be arrogantly made by the sociologist into the opposite of that which it knows itself to be. Can anyone but a Philistine, you will ask, talk about lyric poetry and society? Clearly, the suspicion can only be obviated when lyric works are not misused as objects for the demonstration of social theses, when instead their relation to social matters exposes something of their essential quality, something of the reason for the poetic worth. Such a relation must not lead us away from the works, it must lead us more deeply into them. This is really to be expected, however, as a moment's reflection will show, for the meaning of a poem is not merely the expression of individual experiences and stirrings of emotion. Rather, these become artistic only when, precisely because of their defined aesthetic form, they participate in the generality of things. Of course, what a lyric poem expresses is not necessarily what everyone experiences. Its generality is not a general will, not a generality which arises from an ability to communicate just those things which others are not able to express. Rather, the descent into individuality raises the lyric poem to the realm of the general by virtue of its bringing to light things undistorted, ungrasped, things not yet subsumed, and thus the poem anticipates, in an abstract way, a condition in which no mere generalities, i.e. extreme particularities, can bind and chain that which is human. From a condition of unrestrained individuation, the lyric work strives for, awaits the realm of the general. The peculiar danger of the lyric, however, is that its own principle of individuation never guarantees the creation of compelling authenticity. It is powerless to prevent itself from remaining stuck in the accidentals of naked, isolated existence. The generality of the lyric poem's content is nevertheless essentially social in nature. Only he understands what the poem says who perceives in its solitude the voice of humanity. Indeed, the loneliness of the lyric expression itself is latent in our individualistic and ultimately atomistic society, just as by contrast its general binding validity derives from the denseness of its individuation. For this reason, the thinking through of a work of art justly requires a concrete inquiry into social content. No proper effort at understanding can satisfy itself with vague feelings of universality and inclusiveness. Such a precisely specifying cast of thought is not at odds with art and does not add merely external commentary. It is in fact required by every linguistic creation. The poem's indigenous material, its patterns and ideas, cannot be exhausted through mere static contemplation. In order to be contemplated aesthetically, they ask to be thought through. And a thought once set in motion by a poem cannot be cut off at the poem's behest. All right, so to recall from last week, I mentioned that Adorno is picking up from a section of Lukacs' Theory of the Novel, where Lukacs raises lyric poetry as a kind of complementary phenomenon to the novel form. So let's bring up Lukacs' Theory of the Novel. Okay. This is the section that we want to look at. So recall that from last week, the novel, one of the things that defines it is how time is a character in the novel, how it thematizes time, and the time of reading is related to the time of the narrative, meaning from the beginning to the end of the novel, the reader is supposed to experience a process of transformation. So what defines the novel is, in Lukacs' sense, an essential arc of transformation in which the character realizes his or herself in a specific way, becomes who they are. So lyric poetry, by contrast, it's also concerned with this thematization of the individual subject, but lifts a moment out of time. So time is not a character in the lyric poem in the way that it is in the novel. Now, there's a common background for both lyric poetry and the novel, and that's the epic. So the epic was originally, in the oral tradition especially, but early on, in the written tradition, the epic is an epic poem. So there's epic literature that the novel transforms. There's also epic poetry and the emergence of lyric poetry from epic poetry. And really two different traditions. So epic poetry, which is really the poetry of historical events, historical figures, historical events, versus lyric poetry, which is about the individual song. That's what lyric means. That's what the lyre, the lyric poem, it's about the song of the individual. It's not the song of the collective. It's not the song of the tribe. It's the song of the individual. It has ancient roots, but by the bourgeois era, namely the post-Renaissance era, lyric poetry really comes into its own. And by the 19th century, really epic poetry falls out of practice, and all poetry becomes lyric poetry. I think that I mentioned last week, I'm not sure if I did that. So there's a parallel here with history painting and easel painting. So there were two traditions of painting, history painting and easel painting. But by the 19th century, all painting becomes easel painting. Even history painting becomes composed in terms of easel painting. So geared towards the individual viewer, geared towards the individual subject, as opposed to the collective subject of history painting.
Did that directly relate to the monetization of art, or wanting to sell it, or change the way that we understand the process?
It certainly does. So the easel painting is transportable. It's commodifiable in a way that the history painting is not. So the history painting typically is a kind of in situ. It's part of the public architecture. It has a kind of monumental character to it. And so it's not portable in the way the easel painting by definition is, and therefore less apt to be an object of circulation. Right? So less commodifiable in that sense, for sure. That certainly is part of it. Yeah.
It seems like between these two examples, there's a really long historical gap. Is there like thought as to why paintings have been 2 centuries ahead of poetry in its sense?
Well, poetry, what I'll say about this is that, again, even epic poetry, insofar as it's written after the Renaissance, starts to take on more the character of lyricism. And one example that we have that's a kind of crucial bourgeois literary example is Shakespeare. So Shakespeare as a dramatist, as a playwright, but also as a poet. like clearly, and we could also say that, Dante, if we're starting our story of the novel with Dante, Dante is also an originator of lyric poetry. So lyric poetry, it has sort of two histories. It has one history going back to classical antiquity, and it has another history in the bourgeois era, like starting with the Renaissance. Now before that, there's court poetry, there's kind of parallel court poetry. But lyricism in the sense of the individual as such, as opposed to merely the individual voice, out of the collective voice, but the individual as such, that has a more proximate history. Now, easel painting also starts to come into its own in the Renaissance. So again, it's not wholly unprecedented, but it starts coming into its own. And you just have a gradual, over the course of hundreds of years, emergence of the individuated subject as such. Meaning, not just, we have portraiture, still lifes, landscapes, those are the genres of the easel painting. Not just, that these lend themselves to individual viewership more readily than history painting does, but that the experience of painting is really about the individual subject. So it's not like a genre distinction. It's not like, now I'm participating in a more collective thing, now I'm participating in a more individual thing. But really, art becomes individuated in the way that Nietzsche talked about in the Birth of Tragedy. The principium individuationis, meaning the work of art is structured around producing and thematizing this individual experience. All right, so the individual is not just a kind of character mask in the collective, but has some irreducible quality to it. Right, because of course there's individual voice in the epic poem, and there are individual characters in the history painting, and there's kind of, it does speak to individuals, but within a different kind of context. So, but Mark, I think you were getting at something in terms of like literature versus visual art.
Yeah. The way you kind of talk about it now maybe spreads it out a little bit more, but it's sounding like the 19th century versus, say, like the 17th century.
There is a distinction to be observed, though. It's peculiar. So around the French Revolution, there's one last gasp of history painting. So David is a...
In the United States, in the early colonies.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. In the American Revolution as well, absolutely. But what's peculiar is how history painting just sort of falls by the wayside in the 19th century. It makes a 20th century comeback. There's kind of muralism. There's a kind of attempt to restore history painting. Huh?
Socialist realism.
Socialist realism, well, I was going to say fascist art, socialist realism, like New Deal, Works Progress Administration art. There is an attempt to do that. But even then, right, it feels like forced. It doesn't feel like an organic development. And epic poetry has also been taken up in the 20th century, but almost as an avant-garde kind of move. Right. So, one of the things that we're dealing with here in the reading is this very short interval of all poetry becoming lyric poetry, and then lyric poetry going into crisis. So it's. I was thinking about this earlier today, this peculiar Hegelian idea, which is that as soon as something completes itself, it goes into self-contradiction and crisis. So the self-contradiction and crisis of something is actually its completion. Right? It's sort of inseparable. So it sort of defies our notion of what it means for something to be complete and for something to be self-contradictory. Right? But that's how Lukacs was dealing with the novel, that the novel attains and then immediately sort of enters into a kind of crisis. And Adorno is going to try to follow a similar schema with regard to lyric poetry. Right, so it's not as if there's any kind of normative case. Right? What you have is a story of emergence and then this paradoxical completion and crisis. We could say that this is also true with painting and with the easel painting tradition. That on the one hand, the easel painting tradition really comes into its own in Romanticism, but as a function of it being in crisis. Right, so the easel painting of the old masters seems different than the easel painting of the 19th century, the easel painting of Romanticism. Even though it's trying to canonize, like sort of follow in the footsteps of that. So, again, the full emergence of the individual as such is its crisis. This is why we have, let me just say, lyric poetry and society, the way Adorno brings in sociology. The paradox is that sociology as a discipline is entirely a function of capitalism. It's a late function of capitalism. Sociology is invented in the 19th century, and the sociology that really was canonized, as opposed to being a kind of an offbeat and utopian socialist endeavor, is of the late 19th century. So it's kind of like the scientific understanding of society is actually an expression of society's crisis, meaning why people have to investigate society as an object is inseparable from the fact that that object is no longer a stable object at all. So again, it's not normative or descriptive. This is what Marcuse was trying to get at. Right, so not affirmative, but critical. Meaning, what does it mean to grasp something critically, which is very different from what we're used to doing. We're used to doing a descriptive theory and normative theory. We're not used to doing critical theory, and in fact, critical theory is entirely foreign to the universe of discourse and action, to use Marcuse's phrase. It's entirely foreign to the way we ordinarily do discourse and the way we are subjects of action, of practical action, such as it is. Now, by the way, that introduces the question of time and also what it means to kind of eternalize a moment, to take a moment outside of the flow of time, especially when time, if we go all the way back to Kant, to where we started the course, time and space are irreducible categories of experience for Kant, meaning in order to be subjects, we have to have notions of time and space. We have to be capable of experiencing time and space. But what are time and space? Time and space are projections of action, meaning we get our notions of space and time from our practical action. So on the one hand, to be an intelligent being, in Kant's terminology, one has to operate with an experience and therefore notions of time and space. On the other hand, like the true, the good, and the beautiful, time and space are variable across historical time and across cultures. So different cultures and different historical moments have experienced space and time very differently than we do. Right, so time and space are constants, time and space are variables. The novel and lyric poetry are complementary phenomena because of how they approach time and the subjective experience of time, the subjectivity of time, from seemingly opposite angles, from complementary sides. So where the novel tries to really bring out the process of time as the aesthetic object of the narrative form, lyric poetry seems to be about transcending time or resisting time or freezing time. And again, the idea here maybe this is not at all evident, but let me at least introduce this, is that time has become problematical in capitalism. Time itself becomes problematical in capitalism. Our experience of time becomes problematical in capitalism, meaning we don't just have a different experience of time than other historical periods or other cultures, but in fact, our experience of time is itself self-contradictory and in crisis. And that affects the novel form, it affects lyric poetry, it affects all the art forms, because it affects subjectivity. So if we go back to the first week of class, Susan Buck-Morse, artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. The critical moment of aesthetic experience, but let's think about the aesthetic experience part of it, to sustain the aesthetic experience and to make conscious what was only dimly perceivable before, but make conscious aesthetically, not just terminologically or theoretically or conceptually, but to make conscious experienceable aesthetically. But what if we're trying to give form to an experience that is self-contradictory, an experience that seems very uncertain, an experience that seems to be in crisis? This is the sort of Frankfurt School idea, a notorious idea of the crisis of experience. That capitalism represents a crisis of experience, and that modernist art and literature is about that crisis of experience. So it's about the subjective experience, again, the Marcuse that we just read together. It's a crisis of the subjective experience. It's also a crisis of the objective experience. Now, by the by, Adorno mentions, 30 years ago we had phenomenologies of everything, right? So in the 20th century, phenomenology had its kind of moment in philosophy. So why wasn't philosophy always about phenomenology? Going back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, weren't Kant and Hegel already phenomenological? Wasn't it already about appearances? Wasn't it already about the appearance of appearance? To use Nietzsche's language, art, the appearance of appearance. Wasn't it always phenomenological? Well, no. In the 20th century, there had to be a whole new school of philosophy called phenomenology. It's had a huge impact. It impacted postmodernism. Heidegger's part of it. Because, in fact, accounting for the appearance of appearance, experience itself, the phenomenal itself, became problematical. Here's our word in the Lukacs. Lyric poetry can ignore the phenomenalization of first nature and can create a protean mythology of substantial subjectivity out of the constitutive strength of its ignorance. In lyric poetry, only the great moment exists, the moment at which the meaningful unity of nature and soul, or their meaningful divorce, the necessary and affirmed loneliness of the soul, becomes eternal. So eternal just means outside of time. At the lyrical moment, the purest interiority of the soul, set apart from duration without choice, lifted above the obscurely determined multiplicity of things, solidifies into substance, whilst alien, unknowable nature is driven from within to agglomerate into a symbol that is illuminated throughout. Yet this relationship between soul and nature can be produced only at lyrical moments. Otherwise, nature is transformed, because of its lack of meaning, into a kind of picturesque lumber room of sensuous symbols for literature. It seemed to be fixed in its bewitched mobility, and can only be reduced to a meaningfully animated calm by the magic word of lyricism. That's why I brought Wordsworth in this time because we had like Wordsworth really going there with the early draft of the Prelude. Such moments are constitutive and form determining only for lyric poetry. Only in lyric poetry do these direct, sudden flashes of the substance become like lost original manuscripts, suddenly made legible. Only in lyric poetry is the subject, the vehicle of such experiences, transformed into the sole carrier of meaning, the only true reality. Drama is played out in a sphere that lies beyond such reality. And in the epic forms, the subjective experience remains inside the subject. It becomes mood. And nature, bereft of its senseless, autonomous life, as well as of its meaningful symbolism, becomes a background, a piece of scenery, an accompanying voice. It has lost its independence and is only a sensuously perceptible projection of the essential, of interiority. The second nature, the nature of man-made structures, has no lyrical substantiality. Its forms are too rigid to adapt themselves to the symbol-creating moment. The content of the second nature, precipitated by its own laws, is too definite to be able to rid itself of those elements which, in lyric poetry, are bound to become essayistic. Furthermore, these elements are so much at the mercy of laws, are so absolutely devoid of any sensuous valency of existence independent from laws, that without them, they can only disintegrate into nothingness. The second nature is not dumb, sensuous, and yet senseless like the first. It is a complex of senses, meanings, which has become rigid and strange, and which no longer awakens interiority. It is a charnel house of long-dead interiorities. The second nature can only be brought to life, if this were possible, by the metaphysical act of reawakening the souls, which in an early or ideal existence created or preserved it. It can never be animated by another interiority. It is too akin to the soul's aspirations to be treated by the soul as mere raw material for moods, yet too alien to those aspirations ever to become their appropriate and adequate expression. Estrangement from nature, first nature, the modern sentimental attitude to nature, is only a projection of man's experience of his self-made environment as a prison instead of as a parental home. Okay, so this is his kind of analogy to the novel form. That the novel form is the product of a problematical civilization as opposed to an integrated civilization. So we addressed this last time as the paradox, the dialectical contradiction, that the epic is pure art, but also it's kind of not art. Meaning it doesn't have a sort of aesthetic justification. Its justification is entirely embedded in its social context, and yet appears to be pure art in the sense of a pure instantiation of form. So it has a kind of purity of linguistic form, whereas the novel is half art and half non-art, with the half non-art being journalism. And so inseparable from a kind of corrupted secular reality that prevents its language, its linguistic form, from having this kind of purity that the epic in the older tradition had. So lyric poetry is very parallel to this. It's again, a complementary phenomenon. However, time changes how it functions. So, first nature is nature that appears to be outside of history. Second nature appears to be nature that's within history. I think that early on in the course we talked about how in this German language philosophical discourse, the term nature has a different connotation than it has in English. So in English, it's physical and biological nature. In German, it refers to everything that is also cultural and social and historical. So everything that has come into being and not just the physical and biological nature. So natural history, that's a term that they use, means also social and cultural history. So it's everything that we're born into, everything that just is the case, everything that exists. Whereas second nature appears to be that which we're in the process of constructing. So second nature is an emergent principle of first nature. These last two paragraphs of this section I want to turn to now. When the structures made by man for man are really adequate to man, they are his necessary and native home. And he does not know the nostalgia that posits and experiences nature as the object of its own seeking and finding. The first nature, nature is a set of laws for pure cognition. Nature is the bringer of comfort to pure feeling, is nothing other than the historico-philosophical objectivation of man's alienation from his own constructs. When the sole content of these constructs can no longer directly become soul, when the constructs no longer appear as the agglomerate and concentrate of interiorities, which can at any moment be transformed back into soul, then they must, in order to subsist, achieve a power which dominates men blindly, without exception or choice. And so men call law the recognition of the power that holds them in thrall, and they conceptualize as law their despair at its omnipotence and universality, conceptualize it into a sublime and exalting logic, a necessity that is eternal, immutable, and beyond the reach of man. Like I said, we keep these thoughts in mind when we look at the examples that Adorno has in his essay that will help us. Examples, we have the English translations in for footnotes or the endnotes. So we have Goethe, we have Marika, and we have Jorge. Okay, so historically, we're looking at the turn of the 19th century, the mid-19th century, and then the turn of the 20th century. So we have these sort of three different moments. So if we keep in mind our timeline that we've addressed previously, it's basically the kind of end of the bourgeois moment, the full coming to consciousness of bourgeois society at the end of the 18th century, then the emergence of capitalism and this kind of transitional moment into the crisis of capitalism in the 19th century, and then finally high modernism. So Stefan Jorge, he's the head of what's known as the Jorge Circle, and that's like a group of poets and other thinkers and philosophers and artists who are exemplars of German modernism. However, they tend to understand their own modernism in romantic terms. So in our very first week, we read the Rilke, The Archaic Torso of Apollo. That would be an example of, like, Rilke is part of the Jorge circle. So Rilke is another example of what we're talking about. Okay, so Goethe. Over all the hilltops is quiet now, and all the treetops hearest thou hardly a breath. The birds are asleep in the trees. Wait, soon like these, thou too shalt rest. Another example, which is the Morita. I enter a village through the ancient tower. Friendly streets glow in the red evening hour. In an open window now, and over full beds of flowers, ever higher, golden bell sounds sweetly hover, and a single voice seems a nightingale choir. That the flowers sway, that the breezes play, and the roses red to higher hue aspires. Long stood I joyous, stupefied, how I left the gate, found the way beyond the town I cannot say. But here, how bright the world lies. Above, bright purple billows flow, behind the vaporous town in golden light. How roars the rushing stream, how roars the mill below. I reel in bliss, confused, misled, O muse, throughout my heart has spread the whisper of thy love. That is, for Adorno, that threshold, so Nordica would be a kind of romanticism, so pre-modernism, romanticism. The threshold between society and nature is where the lyric poem is located there. Now with Yorga, it's much more inferential within the linguistic form itself, as we'll see. In weaving winds, my asking seemed merely dreamed. What you gave was merely smiled. In glistening night, a glimmer kindled. Now, presses may, now must I ever, for your eye and hair, endless days in longing live. So it's, as Adorno puts it, Yorga tries to lift language into this kind of aristocratic realm. So there's a kind of archaism that it's sort of very deliberately old-fashioned language that Yorga uses, but that's precisely its modernism. So that's not the case yet with Goethe or Lorica, but it is the case with Yorga. And that certainly is how the Yorga circle understood themselves. They understood themselves as artists, as kind of aristocratic, sort of, remote, distant from, and disdainful of society, and ordinary language. Right? So the idea is that poetic language and ordinary language are entirely opposed to each other. That's not yet the case, certainly is not the case with Goethe, and it's not the case with Lorica either. Turn to the notes that you guys posted, so you can get into some of the details of what Adorno was writing. Valentina.
Yes.
Right.
Do you want me to read it or say it with my own words?
Maybe with your
Yeah, so basically, like the Horkheimer, I think that lyric poetry is personal, but it's never private. And a poem's feeling become art only when they participate in the generality of feelings. For example, like when form turns the singular into something society available. So that brings the question, like, does this mean a poet can't even speak clearly for themselves, or is that really exactly what makes a social legible? Also, I was thinking about language also can be a solicitation. Yeah, so the best lyrics are where like the subjects tones in language until the voice of language itself is heard. So, and poetry most integrated with society precisely when it doesn't repeat that society says, but that's language that discloses what society conceals. For example, lyric poetry shows itself most closely integrated into society at those points where it goes not repeat that society says. Yeah. And my last thought was about autonomy as protest. So the poem's withdrawal from naked experience is a protest against the world ruled by homodidos, as a reaction against the replication of the world. And we can bring a question there. So, is this aesthetic withdrawal resistance or escape today? Like on social media, for example, where lyrics is instantly commodified. That was thinking.
Good. So here's the couple of different paradoxes that you're raising. So on the one hand, language is entirely social in character, right? So language is not an individual thing at all. And so the irony is that the individual is expressing their isolation from society by trying to make language itself speak. So to make this, social phenomenon speak itself, right? So rather than as a medium of communication between people, the way that the individual can express him or herself is to let language itself speak. So there's a kind of a paradox there. So that's the first paradox. Now, relatedly, the second paradox, which is that it's precisely when the poet or artist, or really the artwork or the poem, seem to be most at odds with and distinguished from society, that they are most expressive of society. Right, so you see how the two parallel things kind of line up? Right, so individual autonomy, whether of the person or of the work, is asserted by the autonomy of language itself. Like as if language could express something that is not about human communication. Right, so it's almost like language as a social phenomenon is rebelling against society by trying to divorce itself from society. And that this is the experience of language that the poet tries to give form to in lyric poetry. Right, so it's a paradox. So there is a distinction between the person and the poet. Now, with the novel form we were talking about last week, we were talking about the three kind of individual subjectivities and how they're kind of unified in their differentiation. So there's the authorial voice, there's the voice of the narrative itself, there's the subjectivity of the characters, and then there's the subjectivity of the reader. And so they're not identical, they're rather related in their differentiation, right? So it's their non-identity that brings about their identity. I don't think that we've talked about this word identity yet, have we? We have not talked about identity. Okay, so let's talk about that one, since it already came up in Adorno's essay, and it also came up in Marcuse in the note on dialectic. All right, so the first thing that needs to be understood is the difference between entity and identity. So entity is not equal to identity. So if something is an entity, it means that it merely exists. So entity is a category of being, or a category of what is the case. Identity, on the other hand, is a function of becoming, meaning something becomes identical with itself, something attains self-identity. Something isn't simply identical with itself, but becomes self-identical. So this is another way of thinking about the is and the ought distinction. So Marcuse was talking about the possibility and potentiality that existing reality denies itself. And so it could be and what should be, but is not yet. So potential and possibility. For what? For transformation. For self-transformation. Okay. So the question is how to make language say something that it's not meant to say, or say something that it doesn't ordinarily say. So we have what is the case with language versus what could or should be the case for language, what language ought to be able to express that it can't express. So we had the Mallarmé distinction with the flower. So the word flower expresses a possible potential flower that doesn't exist in reality. And the word flower, therefore, makes us feel the absence of this flower that seemingly should exist but does not. Right, so we have basically the ideal and the real. And so what's the relationship between the ideal and the real? So, and what, to use Robert Pippin's language from the first week of class, what claim on our attention does the ideal have on us? Like, why should we care about the ideal? Why should we not only care about the real? Protest. This is going to be another thing that we'll talk about more next time. Defining art as a protest against reality. In other words, art is not only different from, right, it kind of idealizes reality and is therefore different from reality. But in idealizing reality, it's protesting against reality. So again, the Robert Pippin idea from the first week of class, which is one way of thinking about the contradiction in our reality, in our social reality, but really our existential reality, is the contradiction between the ideal and the real. Meaning, we live in a reality that seems to contradict or betray its own ideals. Right, so the idealization of reality critiques that reality. So art idealizes reality, and in idealizing that reality, it critiques that reality. And in linguistic works, that idealization of reality is an idealization of language itself. Right, so the paradox being, it seems like language can only mean something as a mode of communication between people, and yet the idea is that language itself seems to have its own formal, ideal reality, at odds with its ordinary use, at odds with the reality in which it's ordinarily used. and that's what lyric poetry does with and to language. It idealizes it. All right, so it becomes more than the expression of a person. It seems to take on a life of its own. All right, so the critical part of it, and you brought it up already, Valentina, commodities. This is the last little bit of Marxism, not quite. We'll have some more next time. But one other piece of the puzzle is the commodity form. And I do not think that we've talked about this yet. This is madness. Anyway, commodities. So here's a little bit of Marxism. But not just Marxism. So if you read Adam Smith, it's the same definition of the commodity. If you read other kind of political economists of the bourgeois era, they all have the same account of commodities. So what is a commodity? For something to be a commodity, it has to have two different values. So for it to have the value of a commodity, the form of value of a commodity, it has to have two different values. Two opposed values, actually. So for something to be a commodity, it has to be useful in some way to someone. It has to have a use value. But it also has to have an exchange value. So as a use value, as something useful to someone in some way, that use or utility of something is always particular and concrete in character, meaning it's always concrete. The use of something is always concrete in space and time. It's always particular in that sense. And in that respect, it's incommensurable with any other value, with any other use value. It's also qualitative in character. So it's particular, concrete, qualitative, and as such, incommensurable. But to be a commodity, it also has to have this other side, which is the exchange value. It must be exchangeable in some way. And in that sense, it must be commensurable. So becoming commensurable means that you have to abstract its value from its concrete situation. You have to make its value more general, even universal in character. You have to be able to, for instance, quantify, compare its value. So the commodity form of value combines these things. It combines the particular and the general or the universal. It combines the qualitative and the quantitative. It combines the abstract and the concrete. Now, on the one hand, there have always been commodities, meaning as long as human communities have existed, there have been objects of exchange. There have been useful objects of exchange. There's been trade. Going all the way back even to the hunter-gatherers, like the earliest forms of human community, there has been trade. There has been exchange. And there have been commodities. So what's different about the modern world, and again, this is the bourgeois world, namely the modern urban world, as opposed to the rural world of the traditional civilizations, where production was a function of agriculture. There's something that becomes a commodity that previously was not a commodity, and that's labor itself. So labor itself becomes a commodity in a way that it wasn't before. Meaning labor was strictly controlled by duties, obligations, customs. It was not itself a commodity. Labor is a peculiar kind of thing to become a commodity, because it's our activity in society. It's human activity in society. And we're constantly finding new ways of finding a commodity value for our activity in society. We're always exploring new frontiers of commodification of our activity, finding value, social value in our activity. So it's the liberation of labor from its customary constraints in traditional civilization that characterizes bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is the society of the emancipation of labor. The form of that emancipation of labor is it becoming a commodity. Meaning, whereas before you were a peasant, you will always be a peasant. And not only that, you were tied to the land. You couldn't leave the village where you were a peasant and go off and farm somewhere else. No. You were a guildcraft artisan. You were a member of a guild as an artisan. Whereas we can change our jobs. We can quit our jobs. We can change our profession. We can change our labor. We can change what we do. That's huge. That's a huge change in society. Huge change. So that freedom is the freedom of labor as a commodity. That's what bourgeois freedom is. Bourgeois freedom is the freedom of labor in the form of it becoming a commodity. Now, capitalism is the contradiction of that freedom because of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution creates a problem in terms of the value of that commodity, labor. And it has to do with time. Time as a social value, time as a form of social mediation, because there become two different measures of time that increasingly diverge from each other and come into conflict. There's the time of human activity, and there's the time of machine activity. So the Industrial Revolution introduces a new temporality to social production, and those come into conflict, and that tears apart the social fabric of time. And what we end up doing is trying to restore the time of labor. We harness technology to the time of labor. We measure the social value of technology by the measure of human activity. That's the idea anyway. So the contradiction is between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production with regard to labor. So social relations, this is a sociological term. It's a term that sort of emerges in the 1700s with Rousseau, but really is thematized by the utopian socialists in the 19th century. So it's a term that Marx takes up from the utopian socialists, social relations, and social relations don't refer only to relations between people, but are also the relations to and with nature and with ourselves. So I think that we've talked about this a bit. With respect to the appearance of Geist, the appearance of spirit, the appearance of freedom in Hegel, religion, art, philosophy. So before bourgeois society, our relations to others, to nature, and to ourselves was religious in nature. It was about moral codes of behavior. It was about the commands of the gods or God. So that governed our relation between people, with nature, and with ourselves. Bourgeois society is the social relations not of religion, but of labor, meaning others are collaborators in social cooperation. They are fellow workers in society. Nature is an object that we transform through our labor. And we are, to ourselves, workers. And we even value our own life processes according to the requirements of labor. So how do you measure physical and mental health? Can you still work? That's the measure of your functionality. right? So if you can still work, if you can still go to work, then your physical health isn't too bad. If you can still go to work, your mental health is not too bad. It's only when it interferes with your normal functioning, namely your work, that it becomes kind of critical in nature, your physical or mental health, which is a strange way of thinking about health if you think about it for a second. And yet, of course, it's the reality that we live, meaning it is catastrophic to no longer be able to work. So there's a reason why that's the measure of well-being. That's a measure of life vitality. All right, so social relations of labor as a commodity. Use value, exchange value. So dialectical opposites that nonetheless have an articulated identity. Related antinomies, related dichotomies, oppositions that we naturalize, that we take for granted, but that are historically specific, come into their own in bourgeois society, are the distinction between private and public. The distinction between the person and the role that they play in society, that sociological distinction. The distinction between the individual and the collective. Also the distinction between things like content and form. The distinction between means and ends. So we have these distinctions that are not just different things, but are dialectical opposites. Now, where does that come from? Person-role distinction, private-public distinction, comes from the fact that we divide our time. We have work time and we have leisure time. Time on the job and we have time off the job. We have on the company's time or on your own time. Right, so I always like to illustrate it with respect to me. I'm your professor, I'm on the job. I'm on company time right now. I'm on company time in company space, meaning I have all the liberties that the government gives me, freedom of speech and all that good stuff, freedom of association, but guess what? Not on the company's time, not on the company's space. I do not have freedom of speech here. I do not.
We won't tell.
I mean, it doesn't matter too much. I say what I want to say. But strictly speaking, I don't have the freedom that I have in my off time, in my personal time, in my leisure time. And yet this is what I do to reproduce myself, to live, to be able to survive. And the leisure time is really only there to help restore my capacity to come back and work again. And of course with professionals, the distinction between leisure time and work time is fluid. You're never really off the job. And of course they have all sorts of employment stipulations now where you can't bring ill, you can't harm the reputation of your employer. So you can't tweet something that brings ill repute to the Art Institute or you'll be fired, for example, right? So in fact, I don't have any of those freedoms. I only have those freedoms with respect to the government. I don't have these freedoms with respect to my employer. But I especially don't when I'm on their property, when I'm on their space, and when I'm on their time, when I'm on the clock. So this is a weird thing that we have, because Guildcraft artisans, they don't have personal time. They are 24/7 artisans. They're slaves of the guild, for sure. They never cease to be a carpenter or a stonemason or a blacksmith, etc. And they can't change jobs either. Right, whereas I can say, you know what? I'd rather go into commodities trading. Something that they do in Chicago. There's the commodities exchange, by which they don't mean commodities in this general sense. They mean like raw materials, like usually agricultural goods, but other kind of raw materials. That's what the commodities exchange is for. Okay. But again, the idea is that this bourgeois set of social relations, really a cosmology, our relations to others, to nature, and to ourselves, an entire cosmos that we inhabit, that has become self-contradictory in capitalism. So that creates this situation. Now, okay, becoming identical, becoming self-identical. Right, so phenomenally, what does this mean, both with respect to the subject and the object? So let's bring in another dialectic here, and that is the dialectic of subject and object. And we have this weird language in the Lukacs we were reading on lyric poetry. Objectivation, subjectivation. Okay, so subject and object, dialectic of subject and object means that it's a process. It's a process of objectification and subjectification. Use a ugly word like that, subjectification, meaning the process by which the object becomes an object, the process by which the subject becomes a subject. And that would also include the process by which things become objective or objectivated, and the process by which things become subjective or subjectivated. The way of thinking about it is the subject externalizes itself in the object, and in becoming a subject, the subject internalizes the object. So maybe not internalize and externalize, but externalization and internalization. So you don't have a subject without an object, you don't have an object without a subject. The other term we're going to encounter is a Lukacs term. It's from when Lukacs was a Marxist, and that's reification. Reification, and the literal meaning of that is thingification. So this process of subjectification and objectification is the process by which the thing in itself becomes an object. So the thing itself becomes an object. So we only know the thing as an object. Reification is when the object reverts into a thing. There's a kind of reversion of the object back into a thing. And that happens when this dialectic of subject and object breaks down. And subject and object appear to be divorced from each other. Rather than mutually constitutive of each other, they seem to be separated from each other. Reification, and he described it, this is Lukacs, as phantom objectivity and reified subjectivity. So it's when subjectivity itself appears thing-like. Now what's going to be important for us, reading Adorno now, is that, of course, art is an objectification. Art is an objectification. However, more than an objectification, or also, in addition to being an objectification, in capitalism, because of this breakdown between subject and object that Kant and Schiller and Hegel could take for granted, you have the artwork as a reification and not only as an objectification. Meaning it's when the artwork appears not as an object, but as a thing. And a thing alienated from the subject.
But if one makes art about that reification, can it be de-reified?
In some ways, it might be more reified. So the question is, can that reification become critical? Meaning, can that reification point beyond itself?
Yeah.
Right? So the idea is that whether intentionally, deliberately or not, but intentionally in a more objective sense, modernist artists are thematizing reification. Like, in other words, they are doing that. They are trying to sort of express this phenomenon of reification. They're trying to sort of paradoxically objectify reification. So the question is, does reification point beyond itself? That's the tricky matter here. Now, I say all of this just because Adorno, like Marcuse, and also Benjamin, who we will be looking at some Benjamin to help inform us on Adorno, they are dissidents from the prevailing Marxism in their time, which is socialist realism, which condemns modernism as reification. Right? So socialist realism condemns modernism as individualistic, formalistic, antisocial, and reified.
Art is always the thing that these philosophers blame because it encapsulates the truth of what is happening at a larger scale.
Right. So, in other words, they have a case, Adorno and Benjamin and Marcuse and others have a case against socialist realism. Because, in a sense, socialist realism is trying to suppress something that you can't eliminate. Right? So it's just repressing something that is nonetheless there. And in fact, socialist realism is itself reified, but in a way that it's unaware of, and in a way that it's kind of obscured and suppressed as opposed to brought out and thematized. So again, critical reification as opposed to a kind of unself-conscious reification. Now, the idea is that artists and writers engage in critical reification without being like theoretically Marxists, but they do it precisely through the intensification of their activity as writers or artists. In other words, it's through the activity of art itself that they thematize reification. Now, first week of class, we read Susan Buck-Morss. So again, Buck-Morss and Pippin are doing a lot of heavy lifting for us throughout the entire semester. She distinguished between art and culture. So socialist realism tends to be hostile to art, per se. In other words, it tends to emphasize social responsibility. It tends to emphasize the cultural aspect of art. So it tends to liquidate art back into culture. Whereas in fact, art has liberated itself from culture in the modern era, and that liberation can't be revoked. It can't be sort of undone. It might have become self-contradictory, like the emancipation of labor has become self-contradictory in capitalism. The liberation of art from tradition has also become self-contradictory. So this is the anecdote. Sonny, did I tell you this anecdote? Were you there for that? So someone on Twitter was like, Chris Cutrone cares about art, and therefore he's not a Marxist.
Yeah.
So it was like kind of like, and this was like a Stalinist or whatever, so a Maoist or somebody, and they were like, well, Chris Cutrone cares about art, so that in and of itself shows that he's not a Marxist. And I was like, I got you there. That's good, right? Like that's perfect expression of what we're talking about with respect to socialist realism and the repressive. Marxism became repressive in the 20th century. There's no denying it. Marxism turned into a repressive ideology. Most definitely. It squashed the critical dialectic in favor of affirming things like culture, like national culture especially, like Stalinism is super nationalistic. So it suppressed the actual contradiction between the individual and the collective in society.
Isn't that most ideology?
They do, that's right. And of course there's the opposite problem, which is individualism, right? So I think that we talked about how every word that ends in a Y is a metaphysical object, a metaphysical category. Every word that ends in an ism is a reification. So individualism is the reification of individuality, and collectivism is the reification of collectivity. And of course you can't really have society without both the individual and collective dimensions. There is no society without an individual and a collective aspect, without individuality and collectivity. The fact that we live in a society where the individual and the collective seem opposed, and we seem to be faced with a choice of individualism or collectivism, is itself an expression of what's wrong with capitalism. That it forces that choice. Because, of course, you can't have one without the other. You can't have any collective without individuals, and the individuals are only individual by virtue of the collective.
Because when you say that, like, art is your hoping is escape culture, I mean, and I guess I'm, like, skeptical of Adorno's gambit in general, like alienation to language that seems to, like, fully relevant culture, like, in modern view. It doesn't seem to be divorced from, but it seems like perfect parallel to culture, like, whether it's literary poetry or novel, like, you know, you said you're sticking with poetry. Just kind of like falling into language, i.e. falling into alienation, somehow puts us out of alienation back into universality. I mean, whatever.
Allows us to recognize it, whether it does or doesn't. So the other point, so Marcuse introduced this language of the avant-garde. Now, there is a Greenberg kind of avant-garde and kitsch argument, and it's there as like a supplemental reading in our first week, right? We didn't really get into it because, you know, we don't want to tarry too much on various Marxists. We'll see how Adorno handles it. But the point there is that actually what was avant-garde becomes kitsch. Meaning, of course, capitalism is able to turn modernism into culture. Of course it is.
But not
Yeah.
even in that sense, not even in this like recuperative sense, but like at the original moment of alienation, it seems there's a correlation between being alienated in society and therefore art becomes this kind of expression of alienation. I guess I'm just not challenging, but like asking
No, that's right.
for an elaboration of what you mean when you said art is irrevocably
That's right.
culture.
Let's talk about this, because reification, this concept of reification, which we'll encounter this language, but we also encounter the language of alienation. And also commodity fetishism. So these are related concepts. And commodity fetishism, so we had Horkheimer talking about fetishizing the social process. Fetish doesn't mean psychological fetish. It doesn't mean like a displaced object of satisfaction. It doesn't mean like a substitute gratification. Fetish, not psychologically, not like erotically, like you get off shopping till you drop or whatever. No, right? It's fetishism in the anthropological sense of religion. So the idea is that the commodity social relation has become our religion. However, once you say that something is a religion, then it's no longer working the way it used to be. Meaning, like in medieval times, like Christianity wasn't a religion. It was reality itself. When it becomes a religion, it's because it's no longer what it used to be. So, commodity fetishism, alienation, and here's the thing. So these all sound like just pejorative terms. Like, oh, it's bad. Like, alienation is bad, commodity fetishism is bad, reification is bad. No, in fact, it's our reality. Meaning, the point is a dialectical approach to these things. Meaning, we are alienated. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with our alienation? How are we going to transcend our alienation? Because we can't undo it. We can't undo our alienation. We can't reverse it.
Being aware will be this alienation. Become less alien or put into the process of overcoming that.
Hopefully. I mean, hopefully, right? But, I'm here to tell you, like, not just Marx, but many other people, like 200 years ago, already recognized capitalism as a problem, and we're still doing it, right? So there was a recognition that should have kind of helped us overcome it. It hasn't done so yet, right? So this is the thing. It's a kind of, it's a paradox, we might say. So recognizing alienation is part of overcoming it, but doesn't necessarily lead to overcoming it, right?
Change the physical worlds.
Can't, right. So what's the famous Marx quote? Philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world, the point is to change it. Right, so there's the theory problem, there's the practice problem. But we've recognized alienation in practice. We've not only recognized it theoretically, we've not only thought alienation, we've had the practical experience of alienation, too. And yet, we have not transcended it. Because I can tell you that Marx himself thought that it would have been over by now. He really thought it would have been over by now. Like, definitely 2025, like, it's like, no way. How are you guys still doing this shit? Right? So,
What if it's worsening our alienation? Because the chiasm between our alienation and our awareness of our alienation is getting bigger and bigger.
you mean our ability to do something about it? Yeah. Able to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Which raises the question of whether the way we're aware of it is also part of the problem. Right? Meaning that it's kind of like the original awareness, when it itself becomes a culture, like Marxism became a culture, became a kind of affirmative description and almost even a normative value. Right? It became an ideology. Marxism became an ideology, and not only in the actually existing socialist countries, but really everywhere. It became like, oh, we kind of know what's wrong, and that knowing is itself a kind of consolation. It's like a consolation prize. All right, so they've been teaching Marxism in higher education for decades. Right? This is why the right is running around saying, oh, America's going to shit because they've been teaching Marxism in college for the last 50 years. Well, no, that's just compounded the alienation and the ideologization of it. It's produced like generations of cynical people, right? Who know commodification and commodity fetishism and alienation, and who are just they just smoke it.
The potential for action is forever present.
I hope so. I hope so.
And just like the potential for art is always present.
I hope so about that too, although there's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
No.
Well, I mean, look, we're in an art school, yes. And so we're in an art school that academicizes the avant-garde.
Sure, but art habitable contexts and places. No matter where we are in humanity, that's the one thing
We'll see what Adorno has to say about that. No, it's a funny thing. So there's art and there's art. There's art, so we can talk about the human revolution anthropologically, meaning as long as humans have been human and not animal, they've made art. That's true. And yet also, it's true that we only have art per se in the last few hundred years. And we only have art in the way that we problematically think about art now for 200 years or less. Right? So we do have to understand that the cave painters were not doing what you guys are doing.
Sure.
Right?
But we're not in the same society.
Right. And in some ways, it might even be the opposite of what the cave painters were doing. We'll see. Like I said, we'll see. We'll see. Because this is a beguiling kind of paradox, we might say.
I think it's reflecting and going at the same time. And it's just like the fact that it does both in our society is reflective of the society itself.
So humans invented language, art, and religion at the same time. They did so as alienated things. From the beginning, it was alienated. Why? Because where did we all think language came from? Like 100, 200,000 years ago, when humans made up language, and then what did they tell themselves about where language came from?
Religion.
Religion. Yeah, it came from God. It came from the gods. Right? And yet it was our creation, and yet we experienced it as externalized, alienated. Right? So our freedom is inseparable from our alienation. That's really the point. Namely, so long as we've been free, our freedom has existed in an alienated form. And maybe it always will. And so maybe the only question is the specific kind of alienation that we have historically now. And we've overcome, namely we've transformed prior forms of alienation. Will we transform this form of alienation? That's the question. Or is this the final form of alienation? The terminal form of alienation, capitalism. I mean, of all the forms of alienation, this is the most unstable, self-destructive, dynamic of all the forms of alienation. And yet, again, we're not making any progress on overcoming it. Mm-hmm.
Some of this feels very anthropologically speculative, but I'm thinking about this idea of an origin of alienation and the production of language, symbolism, etc. But I sort of can equally well imagine that similar to how lyric poetry is a response to alienation. I can see in a very early context already being alienated from the hostile jungle for something, and the creation of meaning is actually a bulwark against alienation, as a attempt to overcome it, which of course becomes alienation immediately. But I guess I'm just thinking about this idea of the origin point, because thinking this way, it kind of seems like actually alienation just becomes a fundamental ontological condition of
humanity.
Or paramecium for that matter, alienated from a hostile environment.
That would be kind of Nietzschean. Again, the will to power.
Yeah.
Right?
But even keeping it within human, it goes all, there's no origin point, right?
I mean, the thing is, yes, that would be true of organic life itself. However, not in externalized form, and not with consciousness. In other words, not with self-recognition, because that's what we're also talking about. We're talking about freedom is always alienated and always presented to us in the form in which we can recognize it. But we recognize it as alienated, meaning we recognize it as some external force. Now, maybe another way of putting it is, let's maybe go back to the text and think of it this way. I'm sorry we've been a little marathonic today. We didn't take a break, did we? Okay, God. All right, let's push through since we only have 20 minutes left or so. Lukacs' point last week and in the passage that we read today is that we used to feel at home in our externalizations. We used to feel at home in our alienation. Whereas now we don't.
No, right, and I guess that's what, just kind of as a thinking out loud, I'm sort of questioning that. Sort of questioning the idea that like prehistorical humans were just like not constantly filled with anxiety and not constantly like the threshold of existential.
Maybe they were.
attack.
Right, maybe they were. I mean, so Rousseau, so very early in the course with Kant, we had Rousseau lurking in the background. And Rousseau's famous indelible phrase is, society forces us to be free. Right, meaning freedom is oppressive, right? So we're oppressed in a way that the animals are not oppressed. And yet that oppression is also our freedom.
You think of it like a second order alienation, but there's no like pre-alienated state of it.
Right.
It's like to be free of this exteriorized alienation would just take us back to the fear of the paramecium.
That's right. It would bring us back to the animal condition, which we know we might desire, but we don't desire it the way the animals have it.
Right.
So, okay. Vanna.
Yeah. From what I understood and what really stood out to me, reading the first few pages of Adorno's essay is how we connect like lyric poetry to landscape painting, to the rise of modern individuality. There's this one quote that we say, landscape painting is the idea of nature have in a similar way developed independently only in modern times on page 158. So both forms make me think about how artists started seeing themselves and nature as separate from society. And then he also mentions, say, a poem become art when it takes personal feelings and give it form, and when it participates in the generality of things. That helped me see how like lyric poetry isn't just about emotions, it's about how personal experience connects to the larger world in a sense. So it's not like universal because everyone feels the same way. It's universal because its form connects private emotions to like shared human experiences. So I thought this comparison to landscape painting was just like really interesting, and he said how like the landscape painting only become in its own genre when people start seeing nature as something separate from themselves. I mentioned that before, and that's kind of like similar to how lyric poetry developed when people started thinking of their inner lives as separate from society. And that kind of like made me question if Adorno see this separation as both like necessary and isolation as well, like one become free and critical, but also it shows how disconnected people have become. And then there's this one poem that he mentions in the essay. I can't say the German word, but it's called On a Hike, I think. On a Hike.
Was that the Moriko or is that the...
Moriko, yeah.
Yeah, it was Moriko.
Yeah, he said it's not only about like enjoying nature, but also a person feeling briefly connected to the world that doesn't really feel like home anymore. And that poem creates that unity with art, but in reality it's missing that the modern conditions. And I'm just kind of like curious if you think like the tensions between personal expressions and social connections still exist in art and poetry today in like this contemporary society. Sure.
So one thing about landscape, and it's in the word itself, but we tend to kind of take it for granted and lose sight of it, is that landscape, like painting, was always about how the land had been shaped by human activity. Meaning it was never raw nature. In the 19th century, landscape started to go in the direction of raw nature. And when it did that, it turned the shaping of nature into what the artwork itself is doing. Right, so you had a kind of radicalization of landscape painting as a genre. And Adorno's point is that rather than the art sort of visually thematizing what we would now call like the built environment of the land, that it becomes like raw nature itself that seems to be the subject, and yet that raw nature is itself artificial because it's being produced by the artwork. And we have this with like the what's the school of photography, Ansel Adams? There's like a whole school of photography that's like the raw nature kind of photography. It's really beautiful. But you also realize that it's the kind of imagery that would not have made sense as art to like Renaissance painters. But becomes the case starting in the 19th century and then is only further radicalized in the 20th century. That it's almost like nature without humans. Right? So rather than like what's beautiful is the connection between nature and humans, what's beautiful is nature without humans.
Or with like a naturalized little indigenous person.
Sure.
Bottom of the landscape.
Sure, absolutely. Yep.
So, you know, like the Hudson School and all that, they would actually paint out all the industry that was emerging around
Right.
us, you know, so they would have like, don't paint that factory.
Whereas the Impressionists did the opposite. Interestingly, the Impressionists like included the industrial stuff. So what's interesting also is that the built environment could then be depicted as if it were raw nature. Right, so you have painting and photography of like the modern city and architecture as if it were raw nature. Again, like so buildings without people, or buildings where the people are just sort of adornments on the architectural physiognomy. And again, in a way that would never have occurred to bourgeois artists before the 19th century, and in some ways not even before the 20th century.
So it's like a product of specific social conditions. So Renaissance painting is more of like primarily religious and allegorical, and then nature wasn't depicted as like a main subject, but it's like the backdrop of it, and then kind of like moving on to like modernity, artists sees like the whole different representation of.
With the Renaissance, though, there was like this kind of attempt to depict a sort of understructure of nature, like platonic forms, like from the Greeks and all that. So like a lot of that like geometric stuff for the Renaissance that you might not think of as like nature, like kind of to them was, like old ratio was like a natural phenomenon to this Greek mindset. Whereas like to us that seems artificial, right? Like an arch or something that seems very artificial.
Which is connected with science too. Right, it's connected with the scientific worldview as well. Interestingly, it's like science is inseparable from this. It's reinterpreted, like the character of the ideal forms is reinterpreted in the scientific revolution, but still connected with it. So I would say that it's kind of an appropriation of that classical view. But again, we get something more radical in the capitalist era, in the modernist era per se.
Well, going back a step up, not just scientization, but like Christianization.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, so in that sense, there was no like opposition necessarily. Like there could be accidental, but there was no necessary opposition between the divine nature and science and art. Like they were all kind of in sync. And by the way, I'll just remind us of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche has planted some ideas in our head, hopefully, that carry forward, that resonate. So he did think that the Renaissance was a moment in which these were not, like the later Nietzsche, not the early Nietzsche, but the later Nietzsche was pretty clear that the Renaissance was a moment in which these things were not necessarily opposed. but that his era, like the 19th century, seemed to be one in which they were opposed, and in which there was a kind of a weird recrudescence of almost kind of undigested religion. That science was treated as a religion, and even religion was treated as like an external truth, and the idea that you could like do theology scientifically, like he thought that there was a kind of a weird like mutual separation and mutual mashup that had occurred, that by comparison the Renaissance and the Enlightenment didn't have that.
But with the Renaissance, so like science kind of comes sort of on the scene fresh with like Prince and Bacon and these kind of figures, but like religion and philosophy had already been pretty well collated in the centuries of Platonism. There was already a kind of inherent area.
It was already philosophized.
Yeah, philosophized theology.
That's right. Vanna, back to your notes.
Yeah, it's just like I keep forgetting what autonomy means, so I just write it down. What aesthetic autonomy means are freedom from practical purposes, which is like existing for its own shape.
So autonomy, the opposite of autonomy is heteronomy. So heteronomy just means rule by something different. So nomos means rule or law. So auto means giving itself its own rules, giving itself its own law, whereas heteronomy means something else is giving it its rules and its laws. So we could think of aesthetic autonomy as art for the sake of art for its own sake. And we read last week, the passage from Marx about the absolute becoming, right? And how production for the sake of production is indeed like freedom, that is. So the difference is that capitalism is the self-contradictory production for the sake of production, meaning production for capital means that freedom of production for the sake of production has become unfree, we might say. And that's where he described it as a wholly external compulsion. So what is meant to be the autonomy of production has become heteronomous in the sense of capitalism. Right? The wholly external compulsion that's actually alienated freedom. Right? So this is when it gets kind of confusing. So aesthetic autonomy, we're going to see with Adorno, it's two-sided. Meaning on the one hand there's bourgeois aesthetic autonomy, in which art, like other forms of production, liberates itself to be done for its own sake. On the one hand, on the other hand, in capitalism, aesthetic autonomy also has the character of capitalism. So there's a kind of reification of art that's going on. And again, the socialist realists were correct in that sense, that they considered modernism to be a form of bourgeois decadence and a kind of ideology of capitalism. Of course, they were right about that. The question is what to do about it. In other words, they were right about that, but in condemning it, they pretended as if you could do something else. Right? That you could do like socialist art instead of capitalist art or something like that. No. But we'll get to that next week. So the attempt to maintain aesthetic autonomy becomes paradoxical. It becomes both a protest against and an expression of the capitalist alienation or the reification. Right, so the defense of modernism, so Adorno and others like Benjamin, Marcuse, they're not they're not just going to champion modernism, but they're going to say that modernism is a symptom of capitalism. However, it demands to be approached dialectically the way capitalism itself must be approached dialectically, meaning you can neither simply celebrate it nor can you simply condemn it. Right, so it's not a matter of affirmation or condemnation. It's a matter of critique, meaning trying to find how it points beyond itself, trying to find how it suggests other possibilities, even if those have not yet been realized. All right, so there's a defense of aesthetic autonomy, but not an unqualified defense, and also an awareness that aesthetic autonomy itself has been perverted into a expression of the apparent autonomy of capital, and therefore capitalism. I mean, the time that Adorno is living, the time of this Frankfurt School moment, it's mid 20th century. So you have like a canonization of modernism at the same time that you have a condemnation of it. So in the Cold War context, in the East it's condemned. In the West, it's turned into like proof that the West is free, and it's like kind of institutionalized. You get like MoMA modernism, basically, which makes it toothless. It makes it into a kind of a cultural asset. To use a Hegel expression, it treats freedom as if it's a possession, whereas in fact what freedom was this kind of cultural asset that you put in a museum. And for Adorno, that's inherent to modernism itself, that's its inevitable fate.
With the novel, we talked about like how it also gives its own sort of like kid version, like it supplies its own antithesis. Is it, in terms of their poetry, is there like a similar Greenbergian sort of pitch?
Sure.
Like what would be bad poetry, or what would their specific category be?
Well, there are two kind of levels to that, right? So of course, modernist poetry becomes kitschified in the sense that it's turned into like a cultural asset. On the other hand, there's also like popular poetry. Like we have it in the form of literally like lyrics to songs. It's not like lyrics to songs are not poetry, they are. And not only that, but they're modernist poetry. They are. Absolutely. So kitsch is a form of modernism. So not only, you have two sides of modernism. You have avant-garde modernism and you have kitsch modernism. What makes them modernist is that they are responses and symptoms of capitalism. One that seems to painfully be obvious about it, the other hides behind the category of culture. So popular art, what we call popular culture, it's popular art. It is art, but it's popular culture where we treat it as if it's culture. Meaning, of course, the last thing that you would do is sort of treat it with this intense dialectical problematization that you would in the realm of like high art or fine art or literature. Unless you're what?
Unless you're
Zizek. Well, or yeah, like any cultural studies people. I mean, it's a strange thing because again, it's not as if we just have like elite modernism and then the people have something else. No, we have elite modernism and we have popular modernism. We also have kitsch. We have low-class trash and we have high-class trash. There's high-class trash. That's a reality too. And modernism has become that, insofar as modernism was kitschified, institutionalized, academicized, and that includes the avant-garde itself. It's become...
High-class trash, you're talking about like bags and sort of thing, or what do you mean by high-class trash?
No, high-class trash is like the MCA.
Okay.
Children, sorry. You guys are being turned into producers of high-class trash. For real.
Not off of the Bilal exhibit,
The which exhibit?
Bilal, the graffiti artist.
Oh, yeah, Bilal. He used to teach here, in fact. But where, is that it? Did they have an exhibit of his work now?
Yeah, it was up.
Oh, really? Okay, I haven't seen it. Well, none of us are exempted. None of us are exempted. We can chafe at the chains, but we can't break out. No. Right? We can be. We're minstrels in this rich people's show. Right? Even political art. It is minstrelsy.
Bilal did a fine dance, though.
I mean, again, this is not to just disparage, but rather to recognize that, I mean, what you mentioned earlier, the recuperative, right? The rehabilitation, like, it's ongoing. So, the basic point is that there's no like artistic way of like being outside of capitalism. What there is exploration of the frontiers of capitalism, meaning the avant-garde is the avant-garde of capitalism. So you have cutting-edge capitalism and you have rear-guard capitalism. So you have kitsch and you have avant-garde, but it's all capitalism. So again, modernism was not, it was defended against like a repression, but that doesn't mean that it was seen as itself like just good or just like unproblematic or some kind of anti-capitalist or uncapitalist phenomenon. No. So hopefully this sets us up for next week. That's what this week is supposed to do. It's supposed to sort of introduce some categories so that we can go into high gear with aesthetic theory. Or we can, so we kind of, like I said, we'll bring in there'll be one last piece of Marxism next time, just as another layer. But I wanted to bring in the commodity form this week. Now, a phrase in the Adorno essay is, it's variously translated as what is speaking versus who is speaking. And one of the reasons why I chose this translation is that it's what is speaking, which is more accurate. There's another translation that is who is speaking, and that's kind of like, no. Now, he mentions Baudelaire and Nietzsche. I mentioned to you guys that Baudelaire and Marx are the kind of present absences in the course. Benjamin, Walter Benjamin, who's Adorno's friend and mentor, he wrote an essay on Baudelaire in which he said that, starting with Baudelaire, it is the commodity itself that speaks through the lyric poem. Right, so again, what would it mean for language itself to speak? Well, for language itself to speak would be for the commodity itself to speak, or for alienated labor to itself speak. Right? And again, that has a critical moment. It's not meant to just be a kind of reveling in it. The question is, does that kind of reification or fetishization? So again, with the Yorga, it seems that modernism can also become a fetishization of language. That's a symptom of capitalism. However, it's got a critical element to it. And that's what Adorno is trying to bring out. We'll see how he expands it in the broader realm of modernism in art. All right, thanks guys. I will see you next week.